Bosco Bytes, coming to you from Don Bosco Youth Services, Episode 1, Part 4. Today we bring you the beautiful encounter that Don Bosco had with a young boy called Francis Cerutti. Don Bosco often used to tell Father John Baptist Francesca, whose life we had already seen, on a number of occasions he used to say this: if I had to point out the better of the two, Dominic Savio and Francis Cerutti, I would not know whom to choose. They were both angels. But who was Francis Cerutti? What did he see in Don Bosco that made him live with him for the next 23 years? November 11th, 1856. Francis Cerutti is an 11-year-old boy and he knocks on the door of Don Bosco's house. He had come to become a student at the Oratory, and when he entered there, to his surprise, he found 169 other boys. Francis came from a very small village called Salesians. He hardly moved away from his village. And so when he came to Turin that was now becoming the capital of the Kingdom of Italy, he found himself lost. Francis remembers the first moments when he entered the Oratory. He says, "From the tender care of a mother who guided me, and who now supports me from heaven, divine providence led me into the arms of a second father, Don Bosco." Francis Cerutti sadly recalls, he says, "I lost my dad when I was barely 3 years old." So what was the impression that Don Bosco had on the young 11 Francis Cerutti? He says, "Somehow I was drawn into the company of a boy whose friendship would help him overcome his timidity and homesickness." And who was this young boy? Dominic Savio. A beautiful relationship grew between these two. Unfortunately, we know that Dominic Savio didn't live too long. He was in the company of Francis Cerutti barely for 5 months. But what a beautiful friendship. The influence that the young Dominic had on Francis Cerutti. Francis, the young Francis, continued to live at the Oratory. He began to fit in well, but he often thought about his mother. He loved his mother. And he says, most often in the evenings at sunset, when I came to the study hall together with my other companions, the first thing I would do was I would talk a little to my mother, telling her of all that had happened during the day. And then I would sit down to write in the very same notebook in which I would write my assignments. I would write a note to my mother. I poured out to her everything that went on in my mind and in my heart. Then he says, I would dry my tears and I would begin to do my homework in the very same book. That book served as an outlet for my emotions as for my daily assignments as well. This sad situation that Francis Cerutti experienced each evening lasted for some time. The sight of Don Bosco, he says, created quite an impression on me. I seemed to find out in him something more that I found in other priests. It was my impression and the impression of the other companions as well that Don Bosco was truly an extraordinary person. He had such humility that we simply admired in him. How could the great Don Bosco spend his whole life in the festive oratory, caring for us poor, destitute youngsters with no civic sense. We were often filthy and dirty. And the most touching impression that Francis had was when he went to Don Bosco for confession. He says, we were surrounded by so many boys and literally we stank. We were dirty, we were filthy, but I enjoyed being myself in their midst. On most feast days, Don Bosco would gather around him hundreds of lively and unruly youngsters. And in a very short time, Don Bosco taught us two important things. One, to be citizens of heaven and citizens on earth. And his beautiful motto, to be good Christians and honest citizens, was something that he taught us. This was his aim. Young Francis would say, Don Bosco delighted in being called the chief of the little ragamuffins of Turin. He lured them into the oratory in whatever fascinating way he could. At the evening school, there was fun, there was music, there was dramatics, there was gifts of sweets, games of strength and skill. And all through this, he led them into a beautiful friendship with the Lord. He led them into confession. He led them into communion. He was always available for confession. He never tired. He was never tired or annoyed. Above all, Don Bosco educated his youngsters to love God. To love God not only through prayer, which was definitely the first thing, but he also taught them to love God through prayer and work. The one who does not work has no right to eat. Francis remembers Don Bosco quoting from St. Paul very often. For Don Bosco, to know a boy well, it was not essential for Don Bosco to hear his confession. One day in the year 1856-57, Francis, who is now 13 years old, together with some of his friends, came up to their second father, Don Bosco, and told them each of something that pertained to each of them. And he says, there was a youngster who came up and challenged Don Bosco. He said, Don Bosco, you will never know what is inside me. And the boy says, at that point, Don Bosco came up to me, he whispered something in my ear, and the boy raised his head, his face turned red with astonishment, and he admitted to all of us present there, he said, Don Bosco found out. I have never said this to anyone, not even in confession. Don Bosco had this gift to read the mind of the boy. From where did Don Bosco have this exceptional gift? From where did it originate? Don Bosco was very careful to preserve the virtue of purity in youngsters. Francis Cerutti remembers on this point, Don Bosco was very severe with those who were a scandal. And with a lot of charity, sometimes he would send the boys away discreetly. God imbued Don Bosco with extraordinary gifts, and for the sake of the extraordinary works, and maintained him pure and chaste. So recalls Father Francis Cerutti. Francis was not certain on going further, but in December 1859, he was among the 17 first young boys who formed the first nucleus of the Salesian congregation. He was among the first 4 Salesians sent by Don Bosco to attend the University of Turin. In 1865, Father Francis Cerutti suffered a severe attack of pneumonia. But Don Bosco reassured him that it was not yet his time. In fact, he miraculously recovered and went back to work. Don Bosco requested Father Cerutti to compile a dictionary of the Italian language, which was received very successfully in the schools of Italy. In the year 1870, the congregation opened a new college at Alassio in the province of Savona. And Don Bosco sent Father Cerutti as the first director. And he was there for 26 years. 15 years later, in 1885, Don Bosco nominated him the Councillor General. Father Cerutti was just 41 years old, but he had great organizational abilities. And Don Bosco used him to formulate and oversee the organizational structure of the young Salesian congregation that Don Bosco had started. Talking about Father Francis Cerutti, Don Bosco had these words to say: "Unfortunately, God has given me only one Francis Cerutti. How I wish we had more of him." At the death of Don Bosco, Father Cerutti constantly reminded the Salesians of his second father. Fearing that pagan education was spreading throughout the schools at that time, in a conclusion he would say, "To love Don Bosco means to understand his desires, to translate his action, his intentions, and his ideas." A very short story of Francis Cerutti. Let's go back to some of his words. Francis Cerutti says, "For confession, he was always available. He never appeared tired or annoyed." In Don Bosco's educational system, the sacrament of reconciliation played a very important role. Be reconciled with God. He used to tell the boys, he said, it is important that you love God, and when you love God, definitely you will sin less. When Don Bosco met a boy and gradually got to know him, one of his first suggestions to him was to ask him to make his confession. I remember as a young boy, my mom would take us for confession. We would all stand in the line, and then she would go first, and then we followed. Fortunately, in the Salesian schools where I was brought up, we had great Salesians like Father Anthony Alessi, who would often come to St. Dominic Savio's Andheri every weekend to hear our confession. This was the privilege given to us to reconcile with God. The administration of the sacrament of reconciliation, my dear friends, had a certain pedagogic finality about it. It was an event of grace. It slowly enabled the youngster to enter into spiritual direction. It educated the youngsters to recover from the corruption of sin. The sacrament allowed the boy to turn a page in his own life, and it helped Don Bosco to get to know the boys better. Don Bosco, writing a letter in January 20th, 1874, he wrote a letter concerning the sacrament of confession. And there he says, the cruelty of sin. It was the greatest enemy of the youngsters. How unfortunate for those who never fall into sin, but how much more unhappy are those who live in sin. It was to oppose the cruelty of sin that Don Bosco exalted the beauty of virtue when he preached on the forgiveness and the mercy of God. He insisted that the boy choose a confessor to whom he would go regularly. Until and unless, he would say, you don't have a stable confessor, in whom you can confide, you will always miss the friend of your soul. But why a stable confessor? According to Don Bosco, it favors completely sincerity in the confession of sins, an adequate remorse, and a clear determination not to reverse to the same sins. To always go to the same confessor allowed the boy to have a priest who has a complete picture of his moral life and whose journey with him moves towards spiritual maturity. We thank God for Pope Francis today. Pope Francis today is bringing back into the church the mercy of God, is bringing back into the church the great value of the sacrament of reconciliation, where he himself is a model. He shows us that it is important that we receive the sacrament of reconciliation. My dear youngsters, my dear young people, my dear members of the Salesian family, Salesian cooperators, past pupils, volunteers, Don Bosco's style of education was not just on the level of academics. Don Bosco's education was also on the level of faith. And so education and faith both had to come together. And in this, the sacrament of reconciliation was important. The question is, when did you last go to receive the sacrament of reconciliation? When we are physically sick, we don't waste time. We go immediately to the doctor to heal us from our physical ailments. When we are spiritually down and out, the sacrament of reconciliation is the spiritual medication that we need. We cannot delay it. It's a challenge to you, challenge to me. We are here in the shrine of Don Bosco's Madonna, and this shrine is known over the last 65 years as a place where the sacrament of reconciliation is given prime importance. If Don Bosco were here today, what is it that he would whisper in our ears? Definitely the same that he would tell his boys: come, be reconciled with God. The sacrament of confession is here for you to receive God's mercy and love. Thank you, and God bless you.